All right, so we've got the quantitative data, the numbers that you can do stuff with. And we have the qualitative data, which is just categories. And then under quantitative, we have discrete and continuous. This is just a different way to classify data. Levels of measurement. The lowest level of measurement is the nominal level of measurement. It's data that consists of names, labels, categories, can't really be put in any kind of order. Yes, no, undecided, kinds of movies, horror, romantic, adventure. You can put in which order you prefer them, but there's no universal order for movie genres. So that's nominal. Ordinal is categories also, but they're categories to which there is a reasonable order. On the quiz, it said something, rating something, I forgot it was, rating something on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. There's an order there. And so that was an ordinal level of measurement. Doesn't have to be numbers. Letter grades can be put in order too. So that would be an ordinal level of measurement. An interval level of measurement can be put in order, just like ordinal, but then beyond that, it makes sense to add and subtract, to do some math with the numbers, only there's no natural starting point. That may not make sense till we see some examples either, but if there's a point where none of the quantity is present, then it's not, make sure I said that right. If there is no point where none of the quantity is present, then it's interval level of measurement. And an example of that would be time. You can put a list of years in order, right? So it's at least ordinal. You can add and subtract and say the year 2000 is 1,000 years after the year 1000. That makes sense. So you can add and subtract the numbers and get an answer that makes sense. But is there a point where there's no year or no time? Other than the biblical sense, I don't want to get into a theological debate here. It's sometime all the time. There's no point where there is no time. The lack of the natural zero, the starting point, is what makes time an interval level of measurement. And then the last one is nominal and ordinal are pretty easy. The two that get confused are interval and ratio. Remember that interval has no natural starting point. Ratio does have a natural starting point. For example, if I say, how much did you spend on your textbooks this semester? There is a very definite smallest answer that would make sense there, and that answer would be what? None. I got all mine free. That's the natural zero. That's as low as you can spend on textbooks. So not only does it make sense to say this person spent $50 more than this person, but it also makes sense to say this person spent 3 times as much as this person. The fact that there's a natural zero is what allows you to make ratios, also known as fractions, and say twice as much, 3 times as much. You can only do that with the ratio level of measurement. Summarizing, nominal is just categories, can't be put in order, can't do anything but list them. Ordinal, still categories, but can be put in order. Really can't do any math with them, but they can be put in order like bad, better, best. Oh, I thought I said batter, but I didn't. I said better. Okay. Interval, it makes sense to add or subtract, but there's not that natural starting point where none exists. And then ratio, it makes sense to add and subtract, and there is that natural starting point. Let's see if some examples make sense of that. Types of movies. Gosh darn it, I already told you that one. What is it? That's nominal. Just categories, can't be put in any kind of order. Actual temperatures in degrees. Can you put them in order? Sure you can. Does it make sense to add and subtract temperatures? Say it's 20 degrees colder yesterday than it was today? Yeah, certainly. So it's at least interval, but to determine between interval and ratio, you have to say, is there a point where there is no temperature? There's still a temperature. When it's 0, that's a temperature. And I can go below that. Unless we're going to talk about absolute 0, unless you've had a physics class, play like we don't know that. Life is just simpler if we play like we don't know. There's an absolute lowest temperature. There is no natural starting point for temperature. It could be negative 32. It could be on Pluto, maybe on the dwarf planet Pluto, maybe negative 5 billion. I don't know. There's no limit to how low you can go with temperature. So which level has no natural 0? That's interval. Measures of greenhouse gases in tons per year. Let me ask you this first. Would that be discrete or continuous? It's being measured, so it's continuous. But now I'm asking a different question. Is it only categories, nominal? No. Could you put different countries' amounts of greenhouse gases in order? Yeah, so it's at least ordinal. Is there a point where there are no greenhouse gases? Is that possible? Is there a smallest answer that would make sense to that question? 0. Yeah, you can't, unless you're putting something back into the air, you can't have a negative amount of greenhouse gases. So there is a natural 0, and therefore, which level of measurement is that? That's ratio. You could say this country's producing twice as many greenhouse gases in tons per year as the other one. What about ranks of cars evaluated by the Consumers Union? Definitely be put in order. That's the whole purpose of the list. But does it make sense to subtract second place from first place? It doesn't really make sense to do any math with those numbers. They can only be put in order, so that's ordinal. Levels of management at a job. Supervisor, manager, assistant manager, and so on. Definitely at least categories. Could they be put in order? There's order implied there. You don't think so? Let this guy sass this woman and see what happens. There's some order there. And so it's ordinal. It's not just categories. There's rank involved. What about GPA? Is there a lowest GPA you can possibly have? Thank God for no negative GPAs. It'd take you forever to get out of that hole. You can put GPAs in order. You can subtract and say my GPA is 0.2 something lower than yours. Is there a natural 0? Yes. And which level of measurement has a natural 0? Ratio. Altitude with respect to sea level, probably another one I wouldn't put on the test. It's a little bit debatable. Definitely, you can put altitudes in order from lowest to highest. I'm not worried about that. I'm trying to think, no, it makes sense to say this plane is flying at an altitude 1,000 feet higher than this one. It makes sense to add and subtract altitudes, say this much higher or this much lower. I'm trying to think about natural 0. Can a plane be less than 0 feet in altitude? You would hope not, but it's actually possible. Where would a plane be if it's below 0 feet in altitude. There is below 0 feet in altitude. So however deep the ocean is. I guess technically there is a limit. As far as I know, no plane has ever burst through the floor of the ocean and busted into the core of the earth. But it's not, it doesn't just stop at 0 altitude. Actually, when some land is below sea level, that's why they can't bury people below ground in Baton Rouge. They will float to the top. They can, I swear. All of their caskets are above ground. I forget what they call the thing, but it's no holes in the ground for people in New Orleans because that's below sea level. So there's no natural 0 there, which would mean that's what kind of level of measurement? That's interval. All right, that's all that's in 1.3. Probably the hardest thing in 1.3 is distinguishing between ratio and interval. You have to keep going back to, is there a point where none is present? If you're talking about temperature, there is no point where temperature is not present, so that's interval. But if you're talking about something that does have a starting point or a point where there's none present, then that's ratio. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so what was that? Voltage. Voltage in your home for 1 month. Definitely more than nominal, right? Ordinal, I could put my amounts of voltage used for the year in order by month. I could do that. It's at least ordinal. Is there a reasonable answer to the question, what is the least number of volts you could use in a month? And, we could start talking about solar panels and giving energy back to the energy company, but we're not. Don't make things harder than they are. There is a lowest possible electric bill, and it's 0. So what kind of data or what level of measurement would that be? That's ratio, since there is a natural 0.